The wind sweeping off the desolate moor carries the scent of bruised heather and the cold, metallic promise of impending iron. It is a hollow breath that slips beneath the heavy iron portcullis, whispering of the slaughter that waits just beyond the tree line. Inside the keep, the air is thick with a terrifying stillness. There is no shouting among the garrison. There are no impassioned speeches of glory or salvation before the clash of swords. There is only the rhythmic, agonizing scrape of stone grinding mercilessly against stone. Deep within the damp, sunless belly of the fortress, old men with trembling, heavily veined hands lean over massive stone mortars. They are crushing pale, dry limestone, pounding the rock until it surrenders into a fine, ghost-like powder. They are preparing the Calx Viva, the living chalk, the biting earth. This is a desperate man's alchemy, born not of valor, but of a terror so profound it strips away every glittering illusion of medieval chivalry. Outside these walls, a vast siege host gathers in the frozen mud, their banners snapping like whips in the gray, bruised light of dawn. But down here, illuminated only by the sputtering, erratic glow of tallow candles, there are only shifting shadows and choking air. As the white powder fills the crude wooden barrels, a caustic dust rises into the rafters. It settles like an unseasonable, unnatural frost upon the rough shoulders of their wool tunics. It cakes in the deep lines of their weathered faces and stings the raw rims of their eyes, a quiet, burning prelude to the unimaginable agony it was engineered to inflict. They work in suffocating silence. They do not dare look at one another. To meet a brother's gaze in this dim, powder-choked cellar is to acknowledge the damnation they are carefully measuring into each wooden cask. Survival, they are learning in the dark, demands a far heavier price than mere blood. It requires the deliberate surrender of the spirit. Slowly, they sweep the last of the bitter white dust into the barrels, sealing them shut in the gloom. They are weighing their eternal souls against the heavy, iron-banded oak of the castle gates, waiting in the dreadful quiet for the first splintering crash of the ram to tell them the time for mercy has finally passed. The ironclad boots of 10,000 men fracture the frozen mud of the bailey, a sound like a million snapping bones echoing through the valley. Through the rising mist, the siege engines emerge, colossal, skeletal silhouettes etched against a bruised and bleeding dusk. They move with a slow, agonizing inevitability, the heavy timber of their frames groaning under the weight of their own destructive purpose. On the high stone parapets, a young sentry stands perfectly still, his breath blooming white and ghostly in the bitter winter air. His fingers are numb, yet they clench with a desperate white-knuckled ferocity around a single, crude clay pot. The vessel is cooled to the touch, its lid sealed with hardened crimson wax, but inside rests the abrasive sorrow of 100 shores, the volatile, powdered remains of the earth's most jagged secrets. To hold this vessel is to hold one's own damnation. It is a weight that pulls not just at the arms, but at the very conscience of the man who carries it. Below the walls, the approaching army has begun their chant, a low, guttural rumble that rises from the belly of the earth. It is punctuated by the steady, rhythmic thudding of spear shafts against oak shields, a vibration so powerful it hums through the very granite of the castle walls, rattling the teeth in the defenders' skulls. Any other army would meet this noise with a roar of their own, a defiant cry to shake the heavens. But here, atop the battlements, there is only a hollow, cavernous dread. The defenders look down upon the flickering torches of the campfires below, seeing not just enemies, but men who still possess their sight, men who still breathe the clean air of the woods. They know that within minutes they will unleash a storm that recognizes neither mercy nor surrender.
It is a weapon of absolute silence, a white void waiting to devour the cacophony of war. The sentry closes his eyes for a fleeting second, whispering a prayer to a god he fears has already turned his back on this place. He feels the wax seal beneath his thumb, a thin barrier between the world as it is and the sightless nightmare it is about to become. The first ladder hits the stone with a dull, sickening thud, and the world holds its breath before the breaking of the seals.
When the signal horn shatters the dawn, its iron voice does not herald the flight of 1,000 arrows. Instead, as the heavy clay jars are cast from the ramparts, the sky fills with a blinding, suffocating snow. It descends in slow, ghostly plumes, drifting with a deceptive grace over the advancing line of steel. But as the vessels shatter against polished helms and shields, they do not release the cold touch of winter. They release the Calx Viva, the living fire that drinks the moisture of the world to fuel its own terrible hunger. The horror begins not with a blow, but with a sudden searing thirst. The white dust finds the dampness of a soldier's sweat, the salt of tears in wide, panicked eyes, and the wet, gasping breath of a screaming throat. In an instant, the powder boils. It is a cruel alchemy that turns a man's own life force into the catalyst for his destruction. The air, once crisp with the morning frost, thickens with the sharp, metallic tang of searing flesh and the chemical bite of the caustic mist. The battlefield is no longer a place of clashing swords. It is a landscape of frantic, clawing shadows. Men who once prided themselves on the strength of their plate and mail now find their protection has become their tomb. A frantic clatter rises from the mud, the sound of fumbling, blistered fingers tearing at leather straps and iron buckles, trying to escape armor that has become a kiln. It is a weapon that turns a man's very breath into fire, burning from the inside out until the lungs are but ash and the voice is a hollow rasp. The grand pageantry of war, the silken banners, the noble heraldry, the rigid ranks of disciplined infantry simply vanishes. Through the veil of writhing, milky dust, a lone raven cuts a silent path across the face of the pale, indifferent sun. Down below, the battlefield is reduced to a singular, writhing mass of humanity, stripped of allegiance and pride. There are no longer attackers or defenders, only a collective agony begging for the mercy of the dark. The white fog lingers long after the screaming has died down to a whimper, settling over the fallen like a shroud for a world that has forgotten how to be human. Twilight falls not with the soft grace of evening, but with a heavy, suffocating stillness that weighs upon the lungs like wet wool. The cacophony of the assault has been replaced by a silence so profound it feels predatory. Below the outer curtain wall, the moat has become a graveyard of nightmares. It is choked not only with the twisted shapes of the fallen, but with a thick, milky froth, a toxic, bubbling residue that glows with a faint, ghostly luminescence under the rising moon. It is the curdled breath of the earth itself, a white bile that has swallowed the iron and the flesh of men. High above, the defenders stand upon the battlements like statues carved from cold ash. They do not cheer. They do not embrace. Their faces are smeared with soot and the pale, powdery grit of their own making, the indelible mark of a sin that cannot be washed away with mere water. Each man stares into the dark, his eyes fixed on the pale shapes of the sightless, wondering if the eyes of the dead are still burning beneath that white shroud. The air remains thick, biting at the back of the throat with a chemical persistence, carrying the cloying, sweet stench of roasted marrow and the acrid tang of charred leather.
Within the keep's small, shadow-drenched chapel, a single bell begins to toll. Its heavy iron tongue strikes with a slow, mournful rhythm that vibrates through the floorboards and into the marrow of those left standing. It tolls for the broken bodies in the mud, yes, but it tolls more loudly for the living, for the men who must now find a way to inhabit a world they have so violently altered. This victory is not a triumph. It is a hollow, cavernous thing, wrapped in a shroud of guilt so thick it seems to dampen the very torchlight. As the first few droplets of a cold midnight rain begin to fall, they hiss against the heated stone, but there is no cleansing to be found here. The water only turns the white dust into a slick gray sludge, a physical manifestation of a stain that has seeped into the very foundation of the realm. The king's men look to the horizon, waiting for a dawn that feels as though it may never truly break, unaware that the news of this dark miracle is already traveling, carried by those few who fled into the shadows.
Months later, the royal banners flutter uneasily in the castle courtyard, their vibrant crimsons and golds appearing garish and cruel against the stained, pitted limestone of the walls. There is no triumphant feast to celebrate the breaking of the siege. The great hall remains cold, the long tables bare of bread or wine. Instead, the king stands alone in the center of the bailey, his heavy mantle dragging through the gray grit that still clings to the crevices of the paving stones. He stops before a discarded, scarred helm, leaning down to run a gloved finger over the metal. It is not dented by a mace or pierced by an arrow. The steel has been eaten away, pockmarked and bubbled by the lingering kiss of the devil's dust. In this moment, the sovereign does not look like a conqueror, but like a man who has looked into an abyss and found it staring back. He understands that while the walls held, the moral architecture of his kingdom has begun to crumble. The reports from the surgeons have been consistent and harrowing. 1,000 men who did not die, but who now wander the woods as sightless ghosts, their eyes clouded by the white fire. He knows that a crown cannot rule over a kingdom of the blind, nor can a throne remain stable when it is defended by an alchemy that dissolves the very soul of chivalry. His decree is spoken softly into the freezing wind, yet it carries the terrifying weight of an executioner's axe. By royal seal and the looming shadow of papal threat, the crushed fire, the living chalk, is banished from the realm of men. To even possess the white stone is now a crime of high treason. To use it is to forfeit one's lands, one's title, and one's life. The proclamation is pressed into heavy parchment, the seal fixed with wax the color of dried blood. It is a desperate attempt to legislate away a nightmare, a royal command to return the world to the clean slaughter of the sword. As the king turns his back on the fortress, the ink on the scrolls still wet, he leaves behind a garrison that has saved his crown but lost his favor. He understands a truth that many of his predecessors ignored. Some victories are so poisonous that they rot the very foundations of the thrones they were meant to protect. The parchment is carried away by messengers to every corner of the land, but as the hoofbeats fade, a chilling question lingers in the salt-stained air. Can a law truly erase the memory of a weapon that worked? Centuries have a way of unraveling the works of men, turning iron to rust and grand ambitions into the quiet dust of the road. Today, the castle is merely a skeleton of wind-hollowed stone, a jagged tooth of granite biting into the gray horizon, surrendered long ago to the creeping ivy and the slow, strangling roots of ancient oaks. The banners of the king have rotted into the soil, and the names of those who stood upon these walls have been scoured away by 1,000 rains.
Yet, despite the passage of 500 years, there is a strange and heavy stillness that clings to the eastern slope. Nothing grows in the dirt directly beneath those high, silent ramparts. It remains a barren, lifeless stretch of ground, a pale, jagged scar upon the green earth, as if the land itself were salted by the ghosts of a forbidden desperation. Local shepherds, who move their flocks through the mist of the moor, will not guide their animals near the foundation of the keep. They claim the grass there is bitter, stained by a memory that hasn't faded, and that when the gale blows from the north, the wind still hums with a phantom rasp, a low, rattling sound like the choked breath of men whose lungs were turned to ash. Here, the heavy, rusted hinges of the gatehouse lie half buried in the dark silt, twisted and forgotten, silent witnesses to the day that honor was traded for the cold, hard currency of survival. The ruins serve as a monument to the terrifying lengths the human spirit will go when pushed to the edge of the abyss. It is a story not of stone and mortar, but of the invisible lines we cross in the dark, and the silent, unforgiving judgment of the earth that refuses to forget our sins. We look upon these crumbling towers and see only the romance of a lost age, but the soil tells a different story. It whispers of a secret so dangerous it had to be buried by kings, a shadow cast by a light that was never meant to be seen. And as the sun sets behind the broken gatehouse, casting long, dark fingers across the barren earth, one cannot help but wonder if the true cost of that victory is still being paid by the land itself.